B. Smith, model, actress, singer, restaurateur, wife, TV host, entrepreneur, lifestyle brand, cookbook author. One morning in February of 2004, having taken a very early Acela train from Washington, D.C.'s Union Station, I pulled up to 1180 Avenue of the Americas in New York City to meet with B. Smith. She was 54. I was 38, an executive producer at Discovery Channel. We gathered high above the Manhattan streets below to begin outlining the creative framework of the daytime television series she had just signed on to host for the network. She and her husband, Dan Gadsby, sat across from me at the long table in the corporate conference suite. He, all business, and she, all smiles, warmth, and glow, complete class, and total elegance. After the meeting, they asked me to join them for lunch. And what I most remember about that meal is that when the waiters went around the table taking drink orders, no one ordered a cocktail until it was my turn. I'll have an extra dirty martini, Grey Goose vodka, and 3 olives, please. Well, that changed the whole mood. Both B and Dan exhaled and quickly followed with their liquor requests. We all smiled at each other, laughing heartily, and the very fine meal that followed was enjoyed by all. Our breaking of bread together resulted in Dan giving me his business card, writing a personal note on the back, inviting me to complimentary service at their Manhattan restaurant. Later that evening, using that card, I gratefully enjoyed an exquisite Southern soul food feast and more drinks on the house, all courtesy of B. Smith and Dan Gadsby. They made me proud. It was heartwarming and oh so soul satisfying to see a couple moving through the world the way they did together. They reminded me of my parents, who have been married since 1962. I meet so many people who are so surprised to hear that a black man and a black woman have been married since 1962, like my parents. We met again a few weeks later at B. Smith's restaurant in Washington, D.C.'s Union Station, my hometown. Whenever the couple was in Washington, B told me that they stayed at the nearby Hotel George, which was a short walk away from their establishment. And very far away from B. Smith's birth and beginnings in Everson, Pennsylvania. My earliest memories are ones of family gatherings when all the relatives got together. My mom, dad, and 3 brothers, my grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. There were so many of us that at Christmas we had to eat dinner in shifts. It was my mother and my maternal grandmother, a large, robust, beautiful woman with the fitting name of Hart, who taught me how to cook, and I had plenty of opportunities to observe Mom, Grandma Hart, and my 3 aunts, Mabel, Hattie, and Nellie, cooking up a storm for church picnics and holiday meals, bake sales, Sunday dinners for visiting preachers, funerals, and weddings. All of these events required ample supplies of food, and these women always rose to the occasion with a zest and spirit that filled the house, along with the aromas of whatever they were cooking. Everywhere one looked at home, there was food in various stages of preparation. Yeast bread rising on the heating grate, freshly baked fruit pies cooling on the windowsill, stews simmering on the big stove, and garden vegetables heaped on the kitchen table. And always the food was at its freshest. Eggs from Grandma's chickens, newly baked bread right out of the oven, plums, peaches, apples, cherries, and pears off our trees, grapes from the arbor, and milk delivered in bottles or picked up from the local dairy. Even my dad got in on it with his homemade wine and root beer. He served the latter along with big bowls of buttered popcorn on Friday nights when the boxing matches were on television. The fighting wasn't of interest to me, but the snacks sure were. A sense of anticipation spread throughout the house whenever guests were expected. Polishing silver and waxing the furniture were two of my responsibilities, and I did them gladly, for I loved it when everything shined and our warm, pleasant house was at its loveliest. This was when special things were brought out, and whether it was a pretty bowl or a fancy serving platter or an antique vase, I learned that these small touches could transform a room. The lessons weren't lost when I left my hometown in western Pennsylvania for a modeling career in New York City. I never let the fact that I lived in a small apartment stop me from entertaining. Even with a limited budget, not to mention limited space, I was able to make my place look festive by, say, using candles and flowers in interesting and unexpected ways. I don't remember my mother ever bringing fresh cut flowers into the house. It would have seemed out of place, I suppose, since we had a beautiful garden outside. It wasn't until I got to New York and became an apartment dweller without a yard or garden to look out on that I understood the need for flowers to bring brightness and color indoors. With the arrival of Korean grocers in New York neighborhoods, a large variety of fairly inexpensive cut flowers became available, and the farmers' markets also always have wonderful seasonal flowers. When I opened my first restaurant, B. Smith's, in New York's Theater District, I wanted to make a statement with flowers. The look had to be distinctly feminine, but I wasn't interested in dainty or demure arrangements. Rather, I envisioned bold, sculptural assemblages that would add drama and elegance to the room. Helping to create fantasies is one of the reasons I became a fashion model. That and the opportunity to travel. My modeling career took me all over the world, and I loved to sample the food wherever I went, experiencing a variety of new tastes and flavors, from the spiciness of Caribbean cuisine to the richness of European pastries, especially those Viennese cakes. When my modeling career was over, it seemed natural to open a restaurant that would offer the different kinds of foods I loved and that would provide a gathering place for the rich variety of people I enjoyed meeting. I was still getting people together and feeding them, giving them an opportunity to meet and converse. It was just on a slightly larger scale than during my studio apartment days. I wanted my restaurant to be more than just an elegant place to eat and socialize. I also wanted it to be a platform for the causes I was getting involved in, issues involving women, children, and minorities. So I donated space for political gatherings. The idea was to get business accomplished in as enjoyable a manner as possible. As a child, I longed to live near the ocean, just like Gidget. But growing up in landlocked western Pennsylvania, my only exposure to beach life was via television and the movies. The surfing didn't interest me. It was all that sand, those crashing waves, and the fabulous beach houses. I vowed I would live in one of those beach communities someday. My first visit to a New York State beach was love at first sight. In the beginning, there was Coney Island, then Far Rockaway, and by Jones Beach, I was hooked. Modeling assignments took me to various island and coastal locations, which helped deepen my beach obsession. But finally, it was the Hamptons on Long Island that sent me over the top. And fast forward, where Dan and I eventually bought a house. When I first moved to New York as a young woman and had boundless energy to dance the night away, my friends and I would often end up a very late evening, or I should say, welcome a very early morning, with a meal in Chinatown. The tourist places would have long since closed, but the kitchens were still busy at the authentic restaurants on Mott Street, where the menus were written only in Chinese. It was very hip back then to go down to Chinatown, but I think I would have gravitated there anyway. Many things lured me besides the restaurants. I bought clingy, shiny, truly elegant Chinese dresses with the two-button closing at the collarbone. I spent hours wandering around the shops piled high with plates, bowls, and cups painted with a seemingly endless variety of delicate and colorful designs, imagining the pretty tabletops I could create if I owned them all. I stopped at stand after stand to examine the heaping displays of exotic fruits and vegetables and intriguing varieties of fish, some dried and some so fresh they were still swimming in pails. I wandered into herbalist shops to poke through shelves full of teas and roots and different varieties of packaged ginseng. Things Chinese fascinated me long before I made an early trip to Beijing. I love the culture. I'm fascinated by the aesthetic and all of its attention to detail, and I especially adore the food. I owe my love for ritual and celebration to my parents. They understood how family rituals help give each holiday its own distinctive, unforgettable flavor. Even now, every time April comes around and the smell of spring hangs in the air, I'm taken back to my childhood in western Pennsylvania and my family's annual trek to Pittsburgh to buy us all new outfits for Easter. My 3 brothers got new suits. That didn't take long. Putting together my outfit was another matter. The first item to be chosen was, of course, my Easter bonnet. I come from a long line of hat-wearing ladies, and I like to continue the tradition, not only in my own family, but wherever else I can encourage it. On those childhood pre-Easter shopping expeditions, it took me forever to pick one hat from among so many pretty ones. And once I'd chosen, there were other details to ponder. Which coat, which dress, which shoes. When I was finally decked out from head to toe, my mother went to look for her own bonnet. But as I suspect my parents knew, it wasn't only the fun of clothes shopping or the excitement of having something new that made this ritual so memorable. It was the way it felt at Easter time to shed those dark, heavy winter woolens and slip into something lightweight and light in color. My new outfit was like a brand new beginning, a renewal, and that, of course, is what spring and Easter eggs is really all about. April is a time of blossoming. The name itself comes from the Latin word meaning to open. In our family, different people were responsible for hosting different major holidays. My mother was in charge of Thanksgiving, my grandmother had Christmas, and the host and hostess for Easter were Uncle Roosevelt and Aunt Nellie. They lived in Clairton, Pennsylvania, about a half hour away. Even that short trip was an adventure to us because our own town was so small that we considered Little Clairton a city. I remember walking into my aunt's house on Easter Sunday and immediately being enveloped in the wonderful aroma of food wafting out of the kitchen. The moment I walked in that door, I could smell homemade bread, lamb roasting in the oven, and ham baking. It wouldn't have been Easter without the big ham. All of these were served family style to 3 generations, sitting in great anticipation at the Easter table. I was very fond of my Aunt Nellie, who was a warm and loving person, but she died when I was still a child. My uncle remarried, and his new wife, Aunt Harriet, was the first woman I ever met who was an ordained minister. A handsome, impressive woman with a very commanding way. She took over Aunt Nellie's role as the person in charge of Easter dinners, and our annual Clairton visits continued without interruption. When I was a girl, my mother took charge of the baskets, and my brothers and I thought she was the finest basket decorator ever. What's more, we marveled at her talent for discovering secret spots where the Easter Bunny had hidden eggs that we kids had overlooked in our pre-dinner hunt. We didn't do many official family reunions when I was growing up, but in the summer, there were always family members coming to town on visits. Our family reunions usually happened in August, when our relatives gathered for the Baptist homecoming celebration. If we didn't run into one of the visitors at the homecoming meal, we'd be likely to see them at my grandmother's house. So at least once a year, we'd have a visit from Aunt Vert and Auntie Gertrude and little Jessie, along with lots of other family members and friends who had come back home from New York and Philadelphia or traveled up from North Carolina. I've always loved this time of year. It's crisp and bright and sunny, and out in the country, you can still see a few pumpkins in the fields. There's a harvesty feeling in the air that wakes up all of your senses. To me, that feeling means Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving was my mother's holiday. Just as the whole family would converge on my aunt and uncle's house for other holidays, on Thanksgiving, they all gathered around our table. Every year, I'd insist on staying up late the night before to help my mother make her elaborate holiday preparations. How could I go to bed when there were so many exciting things to do, from washing the good china, polishing the silver, and pressing the linens, to cutting, chopping, and stirring ingredients for all the dishes? In my house when I was growing up, everything was a heightened experience during Thanksgiving. It was a time to bring out the good china, the silver, the coffee urn. We never had fresh brewed coffee unless we had company. And all of these things had to be sparkling. So the anticipation started days in advance. Then, the day before Thanksgiving, the cooking began, and the house started filling up with all of those wonderful aromas. When I was growing up, my father was the one in charge of cookies. The rest of the year, his cooking was pretty much confined to rustling up a big weekend breakfast. But at Christmas, he was the pastry chef. He made many different kinds of cookies in batches big enough to tide 4 kids over through the entire holiday season. Daddy would store the cookies in big tins, layered for variety, and keep them moist by tucking an apple or a slice of bread in the container. That big supply was meant just for us and our guests. In those days, nobody thought of making little packages of home-baked cookies as gifts because everyone made their own. Just as my mother was a traditionalist in her menus for special occasions, my dad had a traditional repertoire for his Christmas bake-off. Oatmeal cookies, sugar cookies, chocolate chip cookies, peanut butter cookies, and my absolute favorite, mincemeat cookies. I remember sitting near the oven, willing that first batch to come out. I was introduced to fondue dinners when I was modeling in Italy. Since I didn't have my own apartment, I stayed in a succession of pensions and hotels. However lovely they were, they always felt impersonal. So when the head of my agency, Beatrice, asked me to dinner, I was delighted to accept. It made me feel so much less of an outsider to be invited to someone's home. I remember every detail of that dinner. Though it was a casual meal, everything about it seemed exotic. I thought it was wonderful and amusing to cook your own food right at the table. And the fondue I ate that night tasted delicious. When I got back to New York, I immediately went out and bought 2 pots so I too could serve fondue. New Year's Eve is the night of all nights, the time to put the past behind you, the moment when the bright new year holds nothing but promise. To hold tight to this feeling of infinite possibility, we want to spend the evening mingling with the most interesting people in the most exciting place and having the most fun possible. I have spent many a happy New Year's Eve enjoying the city's glamour in the comfort of my New York restaurant. We have a very elegant black tie event. Anyone who wants to feel part of the excitement of Times Square, which is practically the center of the world on New Year's Eve, can watch the throngs in the street through our picture windows or from the vantage point of our rooftop cafe. Outside, there's the bustle of thousands of merrymakers, and inside, everything is warm and lovely. But if I weren't at D. Smith's, I'd celebrate New Year's Eve as my parents did at home. On the biggest party night of the year, they joined my brothers and me in front of the television set, and along with nearly 2 billion others, we watched the New Year's Eve show put on by Guy Lombardo and his Royal Canadians. The images of the glamorous partygoers at the Waldorf, dressed to the nines and whirling around the room, and the bustle of the raucous crowds jostling in the cold on Broadway kept us spellbound and wide awake until the Times Square countdown vaulted us into another new year. It was exciting to watch the crowds gathered in New York City, but I certainly didn't want to be there. I considered myself in the best of all places to welcome the new year, nestled in the comfort and security of our living room, and snuggled up on the sofa with the people I loved reassuringly close. I never imagined that one day I'd be part of the New York world I was watching on TV. Any more than several years later, I'd imagine that my picture of a perfect New Year's Eve would end up being very close to the one of my childhood. If I had my way, I'd spend it in my own home and in the company of my family and closest friends.